The lid sealed, and the world vanished so fast, it felt less like science than burial alive. In the dark, the subject lost the room, then his body, then the oldest certainty he owned. No light, no voice, no horizon. Only breath, warm water, and a brain turning on itself. He had volunteered for an experiment, yet every nerve screamed that he had entered a trap. The first minute felt peaceful. The second felt wrong. By the third, silence had teeth. When nothing touched him, his mind began manufacturing touch, shadows, motion, and invisible company. The tank was built to remove sensation, but it exposed a far more dangerous machinery inside. John C. Lilly was not chasing comfort. He wanted to corner consciousness and force an answer. If the brain lost the world, would the mind go dark, go mad, or become something else? Subscribe to the channel, like and share this video. Thank you. Now let's get back to the experiment. What happened next would echo through psychiatry, space medicine, therapy, sport, and float culture. In the mid-1950s, at the National Institute of Mental Health, Lilly pursued a blunt question. Did consciousness depend on incoming sensory traffic, or could the brain stay vividly awake, alone? The idea sounded abstract in a lecture hall. In a sealed chamber, it became visceral, fast. Lilly and his colleagues tried to strip away sight, sound, pressure, motion, and thermal contrast. He wanted not mere quiet, but maximum achievable isolation without physically harming the subject. The earliest apparatus was not the sleek float pod people imagine today from spa brochures. It was harsher, stranger, and more intimidating. A vertical water chamber with a breathing rig. A subject could be suspended upright, underwater, shielded from light, and cut off from noise. Even before data were recorded, the design carried a primitive dread few could laugh away. A loose mask, a surge of panic, or one misread body signal could abruptly end the session. That danger mattered, because the experiment was trying to walk right beside the edge of fear. Lilly and his associate J.T. Shirley began with themselves before extending trials to others. They entered the chamber not as detached theorists, but as men willing to test the void. Later designs grew simpler and safer: shallow, buoyant saltwater, darkness, warmth, near weightlessness. The water was heated close to skin temperature, so the body would stop reporting contrast. The room, or tank, was kept dark and quiet, engineered to starve the usual stream of cues. No changing shadows, no hum of traffic, no page, no clock, no face, no reassuring wall. Subjects entered with instructions, time limits, and the promise that they could stop if needed. Researchers monitored carefully, because boredom was only one possible outcome, and not the worst one. At first, many participants relaxed more deeply than they thought a waking body could relax. Muscles unclenched, jaw tension melted. The ordinary noise of effort dropped out of awareness. Then a different process began, one as fascinating as it was unnerving to witness and report. Without the world pushing inward, the mind stopped being a receiver and became a projector. Some subjects noticed tiny sparks, drifting forms, or geometric phantoms in the darkness. Others heard fragments, a tone, a footstep, a voice with no owner anywhere in the room. Time was among the first casualties. 10 minutes could feel like an hour or disappear entirely. The boundaries of the body also blurred, as if skin had become negotiable or optional. A hand seemed enormous, then absent. Legs felt miles away, then fused with the water. Several participants reported a peculiar split. They were calm and alarmed at the same time. One layer of the mind floated, another counted breaths and checked for danger like a sentry. This duality made the tank such a powerful psychological instrument, and such a risky one. It did not simply relax people. It removed their ordinary anchors and watched what replaced them. That replacement could be awe, insight, dreamlike imagery, or a fast-growing pulse of panic. Some subjects drifted toward sleep, then snapped awake, unsure whether they had dreamed or crossed. Others entered hypnagogic territory, that unstable borderland between waking thought and dreams. In that borderland, the brain could offer scenes with the conviction of perception, not fantasy. A line of light could become a corridor. A murmur could become speech. Waiting became plot. The more a subject searched for certainty, the less certainty the environment could provide back. This mismatch fed suggestibility, existential unease, and the eerie sense that the mind was haunted. Yet Lilly's central discovery was not that the brain died without input. It did the opposite. Consciousness did not switch off in isolation. It stayed active, inventive, organized, and wild. That finding mattered because it challenged a simplistic view of the brain as mostly stimulus-driven. The tank suggested that perception was not passive intake, but active construction, even in near silence. In plain terms, the brain was not waiting helplessly for the world. It could generate one. That insight now sounds familiar, but in the 1950s it carried the voltage of revelation. It pushed questions about perception, body ownership, imagery, and altered states into sharper focus. It also fed darker public anxieties, because the era was obsessed with brainwashing and control. Isolation research was quickly entangled with Cold War fears about what the mind could endure. Lilly himself objected to sensational claims that people simply went insane in sensory isolation. The record was more complex, and that complexity made the phenomenon more scientifically important. Most healthy subjects did not collapse into psychosis after short, controlled sessions in the tank, but neither did they remain unchanged, untouched, or safely ordinary in every controlled case. They encountered distortions that could illuminate normal consciousness precisely because they bent it. Here, the experiment became tactically brilliant as a research tool, not merely a strange ordeal. By subtracting the outside world, Lilly made internal processes visible in a harsher light. Ordinary life hides the mind under tasks, noise, faces, deadlines, and constant sensory correction. The tank removed those corrections and revealed how quickly the brain begins filling blank space. For science, that was gold. For the person inside, it could feel like treason by biology. Imagine trying to verify your own position when up, down, near, and far stop behaving. Imagine not knowing whether the face you just almost saw was memory, dream residue, or error. Now add the harder fact that you cannot simply look around the room to reassure yourself. That is why the experiment flirted with catastrophe, even when every procedure was controlled. The danger was not only mechanical, though the early underwater setups were demanding enough. The danger was cognitive. Panic could snowball faster in a world with no external correction. A frightened subject might misread breath, heartbeat, or harmless imagery as proof of real threat. Scientists therefore had to act with rigor, not mysticism, when running these sessions. They set limits, observed responses, refined the apparatus, and learned where comfort ended. They learned preparation mattered, expectation mattered, and individual differences mattered deeply. A person entering out of curiosity could emerge relaxed, reflective, even exhilarated by the silence. Another, equally healthy, could meet the same chamber as if it were waiting to attack. Anxiety, imagination, prior stress, and hallucinatory proneness all shaped what the void became. That variability was not a flaw in the research at all. It was one of the core findings. The chamber did not impose one universal experience. It amplified the architecture already inside. In later decades, psychologists used reduced stimulation methods to study stress, coping, and adaptation. Researchers linked flotation and rest methods to relaxation, smoking cessation, and performance testing. Much later clinical studies would revisit flotation rest for anxiety, depression, stress, and pain. Modern trials suggest repeated sessions can be feasible, well tolerated, and generally safe. But Lilly's original work carried a rougher energy than the later therapeutic framing suggests. He was exploring not just relaxation, but the limits of perception and the autonomy of mind. That ambition gave the studies their charge, their danger, and their peculiar instability. The tank was both instrument and provocation, laboratory device and existential ambush. For some, it opened a door to concentrated introspection unavailable in ordinary waking life. For others, it turned inwardness into a mirror maze where even the exit felt theoretical. Lilly was not merely recording reactions from a distance. He repeatedly used the tank himself. That self-experimentation intensified the mythology around him and blurred science with personal quest. In later years, he combined isolation with psychedelic exploration, moving far beyond cautious orthodoxy. That later phase remains controversial, but it grew from the same original question about mind. What is consciousness when the usual world is muted? And who, then, is doing the seeing? Even critics had to admit that Lilly had forced psychology toward an uncomfortable frontier. He made researchers confront how much of reality is stabilized by constant sensory negotiation. Remove enough input, and the mind does not become empty. It becomes conspicuously creative. That principle influenced later altered state research far beyond Lilly's own laboratory culture. It resonated with work on hypnagogia, body schema, imagination, meditation, and psychosis-like states. It also appealed to aerospace thinkers studying isolation, confinement, and human resilience. Long before float centers sold calm by the hour, researchers saw solitude as a stress test. Could a person remain oriented, functional, and sane when stripped of ordinary environmental support? That question mattered for submarines, polar missions, confinement studies, and the psychology of space. In a different register, artists and philosophers were drawn to the tank for the same reason. It offered a staged collision between the self we present and the self we cannot supervise. By the 1970s, improved flotation designs made the experience more accessible and less overtly menacing. Shallow water, saturated with Epsom salt, allowed subjects to float effortlessly on their backs. The design reduced physical strain and made prolonged sessions more practical and more repeatable. Commercial interest followed after Glenn Perry began selling tanks in the early 1970s. Popular culture amplified the mystique after altered states turned isolation into cinematic fever. From there, the tank split into multiple futures, some rigorous, some dubious, some profitable. Therapists explored symptom relief. Athletes used floating for recovery, rehearsal, and visualization. Meditation communities used it to intensify inward attention. Wellness brands sold it as premium calm. Each of those later uses borrowed from Lilly's core revelation, whether they admitted it or not. The human mind is not merely illuminated by the world outside, it is also lit from within. That inner light can heal, destabilize, inspire, or deceive, depending on context and containment. Which is why the isolation tank remains scientifically potent and culturally important today. It is a machine for showing that consciousness is not a fixed window, but an active maker. It demonstrates how perception, selfhood, time sense, and emotion are negotiated constructions. It also warns that when you strip away external structure, hidden vulnerabilities step forward first. The experiment taught science that silence is not empty, and darkness is not neutral at all. Both are conditions under which the brain reveals its appetite to predict, invent, and survive. For humanity, that lesson reaches beyond the tank into trauma, meditation, therapy, art, and technology. We now build virtual worlds, retreats, and clinical protocols around controlled changes in sensory input. Yet Lilly's chamber still asks the raw, original question with unusual cruelty and precision. If the world stopped talking to your nervous system, what would begin talking back inside? That question is why the study endures, not as spa mythology, but as hard psychological truth. It showed that consciousness can persist without the usual flood of sensation and can transform there. It showed that hallucination is not always madness, but sometimes the brain improvising under isolation. It showed that terror and transcendence can begin with the same subtraction of sensation. And it showed scientists that the edge of catastrophe is often where hidden principles appear. In the end, Lilly did not discover an empty mind waiting quietly in the dark for rescue. He found a restless engine, pattern-seeking, world-building, vulnerable, adaptive, and hard to dismiss. The subject entered the tank expecting less. The experiment revealed, with frightening clarity, far more. Subscribe to the channel, like and share in the comments what you think about this experiment. Thank you, and see you in the next experiments.